second half of the first diamond, and this is the synthesize phase. So here, you've done all your research and hopefully spoken to enough users to gain valuable insights. We're ready to do some synthesis. So here you gather all of your research and your data, and you want to figure out what problem it is you need to solve and how to go about solving it. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this, and we'll also go into this in more depth in Seminar 3. But at a high level, our aim here is to define what the main outcomes are that the user is trying to achieve and those pains and obstacles that stop them from getting there. Again, there are so many different ways to do this, but in this phase, we typically have a two-pronged way approach to solve this. So we, number one, illustrate the current experience, and then number two, we define the problem to be solved. So illustrating the current experience. Here, we've done some research, and your user could be anyone, so we need to narrow it down on who it is that we're designing for. So one way to do that is through writing personas. So these are fictional characters which you create based on the research that you've done. So you may have spoken to a few users and found different patterns. A persona in particular is a description of these patterns of similar behaviors and attitudes that a group of users may have. And it's very useful to collate those common traits. And it's a useful tool to keep referring back to make sure that your designs are always grounded in those target user needs. Another way to illustrate the current experience is through something called an experience map. So through doing your research, you can then visualize the entire experience that a persona goes through in order to accomplish a goal, usually done in a chronological order. It's not necessarily tied to a particular product or service, so it can go through many different stages, but it overall helps to highlight those key areas for improvement and opportunities for design. And again, we'll go through this in more depth in later seminars. So moving on to the second part of our approach is defining the problem further. So we have a clear understanding of what the current experience, the current goals and pains are, and then you'll shape this into something called a problem statement. So this will act as your Northern Star and sort of hypothesis of what your design should be throughout the design process. So it's used to summarize who a particular user is, their needs, and why that need is important to the user. It defines what you want to solve before you move on to generating any potential solutions. And most importantly, it is to capture what we want to achieve with our design and not how. So again, we want to focus not on the features, but on the outcomes that our users want to achieve. So this is generally the form of a problem statement. And you can see something similar with different methods, but this is a pretty simple way to look about it. So we have focus on the persona, followed by the need, and then the insight onto their insight on their outcome that we find out through the research. So to illustrate what this looks like, let's go back to the example of the new mother. So our new mother needs to find a way to easily stay in touch with her elderly parents during COVID because she needs to feel supported whilst caring for her baby. This will serve as a very simplified jumping off point for your designs and ideation into the next stage of the design process. This is just one example of many methods, and there are a lot of different ways that you can choose from, depending on the complexity of your problem as well. So here are some other examples, including user flows, storyboards, empathy maps, and jobs to be done and how might we statements, which we'll talk about in the second half of our presentation. So that was a lot to go through. So we have planned in a little break now, where you can maybe go have a drink and ask us some questions as well. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Well, that was a fantastic first section. Those first two sessions were amazing. Thank you, Talia and Zena. So everyone else, please take a few minutes, take a quick break, go get a coffee, come back, and we'll start on to the next session. We're well ahead of time, so no worries about that. We may even finish a little bit early, get some of your evening back, okay? Zena, Talia, really, really amazing stuff about some of the steps there and some of the processes. Just wondering about, no need to spotlight me for this one. we can all jump in here, but just wondering about the level of the processes that are in place. And for some people, they might be thinking, wow, where do I even begin, right? Do I start with interviews? Do I start with personas? Where do I start? Both Zena and Talia, where would you start this process? If you are a first-time founder creating a product, or you're a product, you've been asked to come in and it's the first time you're actually building a product, but you're in charge, where would you go?
I think the first stage, well, if you have a product in mind, is to figure out who your potential user base is and try and do interviews, because I think that's where you learn the most insights. We tend to try and recruit people. You could do it through your network with a survey, potentially a Google form, and try and just get a sense of who those people are. And that's the best place to start. Once you have that group of people, dig a bit deeper and see if you can narrow down to a specific group. It's usually the best way. But also, aside from just the user research, you can do more research around existing products in that space. So seek out opportunities if there are competitors that aren't doing it very well, and maybe this is an opportunity space to look into.
Amazing. And what as an organization, K&C, you do a lot of product development, right? Because you typically work with organizations. Of the processes that you've talked about so far, where do you guys tend to find the most bang for your buck comes from?
In terms of most bang for your buck, in terms of like research methods?
Yeah,
exactly. I guess it really depends on the project. So if you are in a really like undefined space, or you're, you've basically been given like free reign, again, like Zaina said, it's really valuable to talk to people, even if you don't really have an understanding of what your product is or what opportunities there are. It's great to like talk to people, to, again, like going back to the outcomes and features. We want to find out where the situations of struggle are, what people's desired outcomes are, and basically just work backwards. If you can find a common pain and common desired outcomes, that makes the design process so much easier. And by talking to people, doing that qualitative research, you get to that quite quickly.
Okay. And do you mind if I ask you a question? What's the worst product design you've seen? There are some fantastic examples in there, right? But tell me about something you've seen and you thought, what on earth was going on there? You don't have to name any brands or anything like that. Don't want anyone getting sued. But I'd love to hear that.
I won't name any names, but because when I used to work in music, we used this place to store lots of files of music, and it was really clunky, really hard to figure out what's been stored and figuring out how much space you've got left, because you'd end up going over the limit and they only warn you at the very last minute. So that was one. I mean, I'm sure there's more. I can't think off the top of my head, but that stuck out as really painful.
Jay, you've been listening along. Obviously you've done a lot of delivery work and product development from the technology side. Do you have any questions you'd like to throw out before we go back after the break?
Just one question, really, and this is more around stakeholders. In particular, what method would you use to find out about hidden agendas? Because I know there's some stakeholders that'll have a few things that they don't really want the product team to know. Yeah, so what's the best way? What would be your approach?
Shall I answer this one?
Yeah, of course.
Well, I mean, the standard way to really get to know what the stakeholders want is obviously by conducting stakeholder interviews. So similarly to how we're describing having those interviews in depth with users, you have the same with stakeholders. The best way to get the truth out of them is to do those one-on-one, because they don't have the pressure of sharing that information in front of other people. And I think just spending as much time with them as possible as well, and you'll build up each other's trust, and you know that you'll be able to share not quite the deepest, darkest secrets, but as close as you can in that professional setting, I guess.
So just a question then. Sometimes what tends to happen, right, is that, we've actually got a question before I jump into that. One from Nihal. Was wondering if this 4-step cycle, empathize, synthesize, etc., then goes back around again before a product goes to market? Does it depend on budget and time constraints of the client? So how many times do you go around the loop? And do you identify that with your client beforehand? Is it a case of natural discovery, or is it all budget and constraint dependent?
That's a very good question. Again, it kind of does depend on the project. And we'll touch on this a bit later on as well in the section that I'm going to be covering. But the process is very much that this is continuous. Like it's not finite. You don't just stop before it goes to market. So if there's a really strong desire to get out by a particular date, then you'll get it out. You'll start running analytics so you can gather insights whilst you're also then running that process again, that double diamond process. So you're actually gaining even richer insights once it's out in the market, because you're getting live data as well as the sort of like anecdotal data from the research. So it's unlikely though that you would run that whole round again before you go to production and launch. But it can, I'm sure it can be possible, especially if your client's particularly risk averse, and if your findings were that actually you were barking up the wrong tree and you need to kind of rethink your approach altogether.
Fantastic. Great question, Nihal. Really appreciate that. Audience, please keep throwing questions, no bad questions, and we'll try to get as many of them out at the end of this session. I do have one more question before we go back. I work with a lot of founders, right? So a lot of early stage entrepreneurs, and actually trying to get them to talk to their customers can be incredibly difficult, right? Why do you think that is? What advice do you have to those startups who are afraid or nervous, or in some cases we're even asking, well, who is our customer? We think we know who they are, but we're not sure. How do I get to them? I'm looking at Karina, but maybe Zena or Talia, whoever wants to answer that one. Yeah,
I can answer that one. Oh, hold on, just remind me, what was the question? Oh yeah, how do they get to that? Yeah, okay, so I think it's, so I imagine fear comes into play, especially for startups. Like you put your heart and soul into it, possibly even your home is on the line, like to get this thing on the, to get this thing over the line, and you've invested a lot of your own faith and belief in something, and then so you'll be full of fear to find out whether you're doing the right thing, or whether this is something that's like has a demand, there's a demand or desire for this in the market. So I could imagine that would be cause for concern. But I would just urge any startup, any founders to get that market, the sense of the market as early as possible. And even if your idea is like slightly wrong, then it's better to know early on, and you can adjust it, adapt it, obviously keep the essence, the soul of your product going and keep that alive. But yeah, so long as, I think they're the reasons people would find it hard, but you should always get to your user, find out what they want, and make sure you're delivering the thing to them that they're asking for and that they're looking for. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It was really, really good. So thank you so much, Karina. All right, I think that's plenty.
Yes, can I just jump in on that one, actually?
Go on, Joe.
Yeah, so just to add to what Karina was saying, if there's any like startup founders out there, a good thing to do as well in that situation is to look for what we call friendlies. So these are people that they won't go and shout about, oh, you've built something and it's crap, but they will actually give you honest opinion. So a friendly could be somebody that well, that's in that domain space, that you value their opinion. So that's always a good approach as well. And also my co-founder Ez always says this saying, he knows what I'm going to say now, and it's a qualified no is always better than a yes, yeah, because that's just like free advice. That's like free BA work, So yeah, so always look for the qualified no's, because that shows you where you need to do some work. And that was it. So
and that's a great piece of advice, and I couldn't agree more, given it came from me. So, so with that bombshell, we're going to go over to Karina for part 3 of the session. It's only about another 20 minutes, and then we'll go into the final Q&A, okay? One of the questions, really good so far, are there any links for the slides? We will be sharing the slides post. I don't know if we have them as links or whether we only have it as a PDF. Zena, is that the case?
PDF, yeah, it'll be PDF.
We have it as a PDF. So what we can do is we can make it available on our Slack channel. What we'll do is we'll provide an invite link over the next 20 minutes, and then we can drop it into the main Slack, and anyone can gain access to it in our general chat room, okay? All right, so back over to you guys. Karina.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for those amazing questions, keeping us on our toes. So now, I'm just going to get into the ideate phase, which is the second half of that double diamond. And so now that you know who your users are and the problems that you need to solve, then what? Well, this is the fun part, the ideation stage, which can also be called the develop stage. And here we take the insights we've gained from our research and we use them to generate ideas. We then take the strongest ideas and bring them to life, improving them through testing with our customers. So here's a quote coming up, which is from Stanford's D School. This is Design Thinking Institute. And this says that ideation is the mode of the design process in which you concentrate on idea generation. So mentally, it represents a process of going wide in terms of concepts and outcomes. And the aim is to come up with as many ideas as possible to try and help solve the problem. Try and think outside the box and involve as many people from different disciplines as possible to help, whether it be the client, developers, or anyone else who you can get involved. And the more ideas, the better. So to help us begin ideation, we might try and frame this with our problem statement, or alternatively with a how might we statement. So how might we help our user reach a desired outcome? So let's take a look at an example. Let's say we have a user who's struggling to get to work on time. So it's obviously a reference point far away about a year ago. But anyway, we might help the user how might we help the user to get to work on time? So one ideation technique we might use is something called Crazy Eights. These are really fun interactive sessions, and you get everybody involved in the session to come up with 8 ideas within 8 minutes. So roughly an idea per minute. And the idea here is to really push past the most obvious answers and be creative with your solutions. So that in this example of how might we get the user to work, this could be walking, obviously, car, train, boat, hot air balloon, like we're getting quite out there, you know, there's no wrong answers in these exercises. Aeroplane, roller skates, even a cannon. So there are a multitude of other ideation techniques as well that we can use. So we've got storyboards where you just sketch out your ideas one after the other and you see them as a process, as a workflow. We have co-creation workshops, which can be anything from an hour to, you know, half a day or longer to like really get to the crux of the problem and come up with lots of ideas. And we've got prototyping, which we'll touch on in more detail a bit later on, but it's a lighter weight version of the final product to be able to tap through all the options, and value proposition canvas as well. So we explore what is the real value statement for a user. And the idea is to be creative and think very broadly. So now, of course, you couldn't possibly design and try all these ideas. So how do you pick the right ones? So we do this through a process of prioritization. There are a number of different ways you can prioritize ideas, but a very common method is using an effort versus impact matrix. So by placing the ideas on this quadrant, you can measure which ideas will have the most impact, but with the least effort. This brings the highest value to the client quickest, and therefore are the ideas that you normally should start with, and always aiming to focus in the top right quadrant. So let's have a look at another example now. So going back to our new mother, There are a number of potential solutions that might help her keep in contact with her parents. Based on what we know about the user as well, what can we build and what we can build feasibly, we can place these solutions on the quadrant. So letters, emails, photos are potentially low effort, but we also know they're likely to have low impact based on our users' pain points in the context. The hologram, high effort, not as high impact. Mobile phone, something she's already tried. And teleportation is a great solution, but obviously very high effort. And this is where understanding the user and their context becomes important, as we know it will have impact in these areas. By understanding the user and her context, we can pick out what benefits of a particular solution might be. So she can see both of her parents at the same time. She can still tend to the baby whilst talking to her parents. It feels like she's in the living room with them. They can see her and the baby. It connects her parents to their existing TV, and it works with their WhatsApp. And this solution is obviously the video call through the television, as touched on earlier. And so now we're into the create phase. It's the final phase of the double diamond. And this is the create, or also known as the delivery phase. So once you have a few ideas that you want to focus on, you want to now test them with real users to get feedback and see if they will help to solve their problems. So we use what we've learned through the testing to refine our ideas. Continuing to refine them through conversations with our users, all of this feedback comes together to form the final product. We're always trying to set new standards with the products that we create, but ultimately it's about choosing the right solution to our customers' problems, and be that a voice interface, an app, a physical product, or something entirely different. And we do this with many methods, including the two main ones, that's wireframes and prototypes. So what's a wireframe? So wireframing is a process where designers draw overviews of interactive products to establish the structure and flow of possible design solutions. These outlines reflect user and business needs. So not dissimilar to an architectural blueprint, a wireframe is a two-dimensional skeletal outline of a web page or app. As a wireframe usually represents the initial product concept with styling, color, and graphics kept to a minimum. So why do we use wireframes? Well, they help to keep the designs user-focused. They don't get distracted with, as we said, like color and graphics and styling. They really push the usability to the forefront because they're able to focus on that. You can really focus on testing specific elements in user journeys. And they make the design process iterative so that we can adapt and edit the wireframes quickly based on the feedback. And they're cheap and quick to create, saving costs further down the line. And wireframes can be drawn by hand or created digitally, depending on how much detail is required. The tools you use to wireframe can influence how fast and far your creative explorations proceed. So generally it's good to start with pen and paper or pencil on paper, and then followed by digital wireframes. And there are a host of tools where you can do this, including Sketch, Figma, Adobe, and many more. I mean, there's so many on the market. We'd be here all night if we were listing them. But it's good to get to find your preferred tool and to, your own methods. So what is prototyping? So prototyping is an experimental process where design teams implement ideas into tangible forms from paper to digital. Teams build prototypes to varying degrees of fidelity to capture design concepts to test on users. With prototypes, you can refine and validate your designs so that your brand can release the right products. And the goal of a prototype is to test the products and product ideas before sinking lots of time and money into the final product. As designers, we should always consider prototyping from early on and encourage our clients to do so. So now let's take a look at a real life example of how we iterate and improve the fidelity of our wireframes. So this is some work we actually did on the Met Office app. And in all our projects, we always try and start with lower fidelity or detail to begin with when testing. And this really reduces the risk of spending time and money making something that isn't user-friendly. We then increase that fidelity as we go on and as we begin to gain confidence with the elements of the design. So if we go back to our earlier scenario of the new mother, and we look at the example with the TV video call, our potential solution was video calling through the TV. So we might go from paper sketches to a digital wireframe, and then finally go to high fidelity mockups. And this is actually an example of a real life product popular during COVID, which is the portal. I don't know if any of you know this or have used it. It's not built by us, and it's also not an ad, by the way. And then we've got another poll question for you all. If Talia, you could launch that, please. So at what stage should you start testing design ideas with users? Only when you've designed the high fidelity visuals, only once the product has been built by the engineers, once the user has bought or downloaded the product, or at multiple stages before and after the product has been built. I think we've reached our limit of poll answers. Hooray! You're all listening. That's great. So we test and, oh, it's just popped up again in my face. So yeah, we test at multiple stages before and after the product has been built. And from testing simple sketches or even storyboard concepts to more detailed designed flows, coded prototypes, and when the product is live. The reason we build prototypes is so that we can test concepts and specific journeys within the product with real users. Let real users test your product by setting up a series of questions and specific tasks to be completed while observing behavior and listening for feedback. And this helps to track everybody, to make it kind of more of a level playing field with the users you're testing with, so they're all following the same flow and same journeys and tasks as well. And testing helps to identify problems in the design, helps to uncover opportunities to improve the design, helps us learn about target users' behavior and their preferences, and helps to better legitimize design changes and decisions within the team. And there are a few different testing methods. There's mostly the difference between qualitative and quantitative testing. So qualitative testing is feedback from interviews, which are moderated in a lab, in a testing lab, or done remotely online, which is, you can see in the example being shown here. And there's also quantitative testing, which would normally involve click-throughs and tracking those, the timings of particular interactions and flows and journeys. And there's A/B testing, which is when you test two different versions of the same product. There's even multivariate testing if you have more than two, to see which ones are easier or which ones are the preferred way of showing that experience. So who is involved in the design process? So now we've given you a good overview about the process, we'd like to talk a bit more about exactly who is involved in the design process. So often there's an assumption that it's just the role of the designer. However, it is not just the responsibility of designers to shape the user experience. Delivering the best product requires collaboration and input from the full team, the client, and of course, the people who will use the product. And importantly, there's no UX phase, as UX is an umbrella term for all of the design activities. And depending on what company a designer works in, there are a number of different roles that you might work alongside when designing and building a product. So we have strategists, and we have, I won't go into all the details because you're going to be sharing these slides with you anyway, so you'll be able to read into a bit more detail as to what a strategist does. We've got delivery team and product owners. We've got engineers who are also known as developers, and we've got testers who make sure that everything is working as it should. And then very briefly, I'll talk to you about the product development process. So historically, software was developed in a non-iterative way, in a process called waterfall, with each stage completed before moving on to the next. This meant that if there was ever a change in any element, the process would start over again. However, there were limitations with this. There was lack of visibility, there was an inflexibility to change, a higher risk and value developed later on, and more money wasted in developing products that weren't tested. However, we now work in an agile process, which is a process that was developed by the Toyota team. And this includes high visibility. So you're working with the entire team to make sure our designers are visible so that we can get feedback to keep in mind different perspectives. And that would include developers and clients, amongst others. It also includes flexibility in change. So we're able to pivot or stop to minimize effort wasted if certain aspects aren't working. And working smart, as mentioned earlier, we iterate on our concepts using the right tools based on what we need to learn. And increased value. So we do just enough user research and create lightweight artifacts to let us work quickly. And lastly, just to give you a sneak peek at beyond the production phase, and this is also touching on the question we had earlier. So the process that we've just gone through isn't finite. And once we've got into the production phase, meaning once the product is being built and launched to the public, we'll continue this iterative process. This is also known as optimization. So we're continually testing and learning about the product as it's being used by real end users, continually optimizing the experience and the product. So we're actually nearly nearing the end of our talk before even more Q&A. So before we finish, we want to talk briefly about different types of organizations that you might work in as a UX designer. So we have agencies like us, which means that, like us, you will work with external clients. You'll work on a variety of products across sectors and industries. The projects you work on will generally be more short-term, although we have had quite a few longer engagements, like 1 to 2 years. And then there's in-house. So this is working directly for a product company, such as Facebook or the BBC. And you'll be working with internal stakeholders. You'll tend to work on 1 or 2 focused projects within the same sector or industry. And they tend to be longer term projects. And then there's freelance as well. So you'll be working for yourself, and you could be working for an agency or in-house on a contractual basis. They tend to be shorter term projects, although you can get long ones on there as well. And they tend to touch on multiple sectors and industries. And at Kin+Carta, what we call ourselves K&C, principles and ways of working. So you have different principles and ways of working wherever you go. We'd just like to share ours with you today. So we've got always zoom out. So this is taking a step back from the details and looking at the bigger picture. So it's always providing context for those around you. Sweat what matters. This is focusing on what's important that will drive the most valuable impact. Sometimes it means saying no to people who don't want to hear it. And beat stuff up, collaboratively challenging an idea or piece of work with your peers, actively providing and receiving constructive feedback. Keep the tempo. So this is getting stuff out often so we can beat it up regularly. Tap up kin is bringing the collective experience of the company to bear on the problem you're trying to solve and asking for help when you need it. And finally, there's pull the cord. So call out a problem as soon as you see it, raising issues to those who can help to action a resolution. And lastly, I just wanted to really emphasize that UX jobs are in demand at the moment. So our company is currently hiring for 3 senior UX design roles, as well as many in engineering and across the board. But soon we'll also be opening up positions for interns and possibly associates. So just encourage you to keep an eye on our Join Us section on the website or our LinkedIn for more details if you want to see what we're looking for. So thank you very much for listening. That's all from me, and we'll go over to some more Q&A.